I'm calling this meeting of the Maple Broadband Executive Committee to order for August 26th, 2025. So the first item on the agenda is to approve the agenda. You've all had a chance to review the agenda. I'll entertain a motion to approve.
I move to approve the agenda.
Okay, and can I get a second?
Second.
Okay, I would like to request one change to the agenda, which is I have a make ready request. I'd like to add make ready payment approval under section 4. Put it right at the beginning just to get it out of the way. Any other edits to the agenda? Okay, hearing none. All in favor of the agenda as amended, raise your hand or say aye.
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 Okay, great. We have an agenda. Next up, approval of the minutes from August 6th, the second meeting. Zapata called out some errors in the first draft that was distributed. So I've revised and redistributed. So I'll entertain a motion to approve those.
I make a motion to approve those.
Second, anyone?
Second.
Okay.
That was Shannon. Great.
Yep. Steve's muted. Thank you, Shannon. All right. Any other comments on the minutes? Hearing none. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
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 Okay.
Aye.
Great. That's unanimous. Oh, and another Shannon. Great. It'll be good to see your happy, smiling face. Okay. Wonderful. So next up then is public comments. Would anyone like to make a public comment? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to move on. So the item I added under section 4, calls for decision and key discussions, is, as you folks will remember, well, it's news to you, Zapata, but we're busy doing some line extensions right now for areas that are designed to close off our construction grant obligations under Act 71, and that either are not in BEAD eligible areas, should we be part of BEAD, or they're areas that lead to BEAD areas. And long story short, I didn't include them in the BEAD bid. So we got just today, and they were actually one day late, we finally got the make-ready estimate for routes in Ferrisburg that I'm super keen to get going on, because getting this make-ready done is a critical path to getting that construction done this year. So it is a tariff rider agreement, so we don't pay right now, just to remind you guys. It's an estimate, and so they do the work, and then we get billed based on what the actual is. So the estimate is $12,429.50. So I would like to request that someone make a motion to approve the payment of that make-ready work order for Green Mountain Power.
So move.
Okay. Shannon tried to say, but he was on mute, so we'll consider you a second, Shannon. Any discussion? Sorry, I do have a bit of discussion that I should have introduced earlier. So we've been using Lee Willette from Mission Broadband on these rideouts, and so prior to bringing this to you, of course, have made sure that Mission is aligned that this is a correct and proper estimate. Okay. Any further discussion? Okay. All in favor, raise your hand or say aye.
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 Okay. Thank you. All right, so next item is BEAD. I put this on here just so we have a place to talk about it. It is 4:12 p.m. We have not heard anything yet. I believe we heard there was a legislature dry talk meeting this afternoon, and apparently VCBB testified there that they would be publishing the provisional recipients on Thursday, which is a day later than expected. So they haven't updated their tentative schedule yet, but I bet you that pushes everything back on their tentative schedule by a day. So they're notifying likely subrecipients tomorrow rather than today. But we haven't heard either way. Could be good news, could be bad. Don't know. Limbo continues. So that's it for the BEAD drama. Okay. So finally, the main purpose of this meeting is the VCBB long drop RFA, mainly to continue the policy discussion that we started last week. And it was pretty meaty and pretty complicated. And so next week, we're going to continue discussion and more on the implementation. I did have one update, which was that I had a call yesterday with CVOEO, and they have agreed that they are happy to do do household verifications for us. And again, it's up to us to set what those rules are. So I think we'd basically copy it on the ACP. And again, one of the policy decisions we need to set, which I think is in that document I distributed, is what income level, what percent of federal poverty level for people who aren't already enrolled in some other program. So the ACP had it at 200. You can make an argument to change it. It's a policy decision. And again, we don't need to finalize this today. So that is good news. And what I need to do now is move to getting them under some sort of an agreement that governs those services. So I need to reach out to NAKCV and see what sort of agreement they have with NECA, so we're not reinventing the wheel from a legal perspective. And then the final thing is payment, because they had initially said that they didn't want to charge for this unless it got bigger than a bread box. And I said, well, there's this long drop grant program. And so I'm going to put into our grant request some amount for you to do this, because I also don't, I can appreciate not wanting to be sending invoices for relatively small amounts and deal with the overhead. So I asked them to think up an amount, basically a fixed fee, because there's going to be some outreach that we do now as part of this program. And there's likely to be some number, we don't know how big, of households that need to be verified upfront as part of this. So I thought that some sort of a, couple $1,000 flat fee to cover their time would be reasonable. So I said, if they didn't come up with a number, I'd come up with a number for them. Because, I appreciate where they're coming from, but at the end of the day, I also don't want this to be the sort of thing where they do a lot more work than is expected, and then they become resentful and, or they don't have time for it. So yeah. Just wanted to give an update on all that. So there's work still to be done, but I think that that's good,
really good
forward
news.
Progress. Yeah. And then obviously the other part of what we have to do is just kind of get the back end in place, right? Because conceptually what we want to do is a household or an individual residing in a household indicates that they believe that they qualify under the rules of the program. They would register in our system some way to say that they think they qualify. We would pass that lead, if you will, over to CVOEO. They would give us back a binary yes or no. So we don't have any of the details of anything really. It doesn't come to us at all. And then basically if it's a yes, then we pass the yes over to Waitsfield. And so they get whatever sort of benefits in the billing system. So, and this is, obviously this is a requirement under the long drop RFAs that we prioritize lower income households, both now and then over the next year or so. And that's which requires us to have a facility to do so. And then, of course, we do have our own subsidy program. So aside from the long drop, as we've said before, it's a little bit challenging from a PR perspective if the long drop covers the drop and then the person can't afford to pay for the service. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And we do have in our budgets an amount that we've budgeted for providing these subsidies, but we've never actually made a policy decision as to what that subsidy should be. So that is something unrelated to the long drop program that now that we will, in the next however long, couple of months, have this facility to validate households, we need to decide how we'd like that to work, at least in the short term. Or I suppose I should also say, if that's something we want to do at all. I'm presuming the answer to my own question, which is that we would want to provide these ongoing subsidies. It is in our budget. It's been in our budget both this year and last year. We've just never had a facility. But still, that is a decision that we need to make. And I suppose also, this is not in the bylaws as something reserved for the governing board, but it may be something that you guys wish to take to the governing board with your recommendation so that they feel included in the discussion and decision. Okay, I'm done talking.
Steve is making a face.
Yeah, Steve is making a face. Steve, you're muted.
Yeah, making a commitment like this means that we're basically going to be covering the cost of that service till the end of time, unless we're going to be checking in with that group every year or every 6 months to see if they're still falling into that category. It's not a free solution. I think one of my biggest worry, and I've talked to you about this, Ellie, is we don't even know if we can afford this. If it costs us more to administer this than the money we're, the positive outcome, if the cost is greater than the benefit, then we shouldn't be doing it. So we need to kind of understand that, and we can't necessarily understand it, I know, from your perspective until we have all the proposed pieces in place, but I think we need to be prepared to make a decision about whether we're going to do it or not.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Steve. And I think just for purposes of getting ourselves onto the long drop RFA and not be talking about the subsidies, I think that is a separate conversation and it is a policy choice. I will say that a best practice, I forget if the ACP worked this way, but a best practice is to do periodic re-verifications. So, you don't get verified once and then you sit that way forever because people's circumstances change, right? And just the same as someone who might be a current subscriber, we might perhaps lose them to churn because they lose their job or something happens. And so this is part of what we need to operationalize. But the first thing is deciding that we want to do it and some of how we want the rules to work. And of course, just because a subsidy program is offered today doesn't mean that the district can't change its mind in the future. I mean, of course, it might be a political issue to do so, but yeah, at the end of the day, and then the other kind of editorial comment is that when you're talking about a cost benefit, I mean, if there's an economic cost benefit, and then there's also I suppose, a societal cost benefit. And so this is definitely a much longer conversation.
Well, and not to prolong it, but just to say, theoretically, we'll need periodic verification because part of the whole point of this is it's going to enable people to increase their incomes. It's going to enable people to find jobs and get training that's going to enable them to be upwardly mobile.
Okay. So let us pick up where okay, actually one more bit of context that I want to give before we jump into some of these policy questions that I posed before. Because it's my tendency to just jump straight into what the document says and what the requirements are and what are the decisions we need to make. But I thought it would make sense to back up just a little bit and talk about some of what the VCB was trying to do, because we talked about before that they heard feedback from Fukuda not to be overly prescriptive, and the result is something which is in no way prescriptive. So it gives us latitude to make a lot of decisions. Something else that they were trying to do from a policy perspective, although the document doesn't say this, but we know this, is that under the BEAD program, households that are unserved and underserved, they don't have to pay anything above and beyond a standard installation for the cost of the drop. And there's no adjudication about who owns the property. Is it a second home, a third home? Is it a $6 million property? That's the rules of the program. And so part of what the VCB was trying to do was to create parity between the ARPA-funded areas where the drop is, at least according to how most CUDs have been handling it, the drop is 100%. If it's buried or if it's a long drop, that's all for the customer's account. And the BEAD program where it's the other way too. So because I appreciate the discussion you guys were having the last time, and in a lot of ways I agree with it, but I also think it's important to keep in mind that if we're successful in BEAD, we might want to consider the pros and cons of being consistent with how households that are funded by different federal programs are treated. Which, it cuts both ways, because the BEAD program also doesn't give any sort of way to have a service commitment. So, consistency is one of the things we should be looking at, and at least we should be aware of it, so that if there are different decisions made, which personally, in my opinion, I don't think that we should copy paste exactly from the BEAD program, because I think it's not perfect policy, but at least you need to be aware of one of the things the VCB was trying to do, and we need to be aware of the fact that we should be prepared to answer questions from residents about why they're being treated differently than their neighbors. So, having said that, does anyone else have any other introductory comments before we jump back into the document?
No, I'm going to need you to go back over what you just said, but I don't want you to do it now. I don't know if I fully understand what you said, but let's go on and we'll get back to it.
Okay. And I have some specific questions about what you just said. I think I understand, but I'm curious as to some of the context as to how it would play out. So we can wait until we're
do this. Maybe we should do
we
this
want
now,
to be in executive session as part of that discussion, as it may end up relating to policy or not?
I don't think so. I mean, it's up to you guys. But there's only specific reasons that we're allowed to go into executive session, like contract negotiation or personnel matters or things that may harm the business. I don't know off the top of my head if open meeting law considers or CUD statute considers potential policy choices to be something that you can go into executive session for. Not sure. But anyway, I mean, if you guys have questions about what I just said, I think it's probably good to answer them or talk about it a little bit more before you start to potentially make decisions about how you want these things to work.
Okay, what are the BEAD rules about long drops?
The BEAD rule is that any address that's funded with BEAD, service must be able to be installed within 10 days of customer request, and the customer may not be charged anything in excess of the provider's standard installation fee and must not be required to make any modifications to their property. So, reading between the lines, what it basically means is we can charge them our standard fee, whether that's the $100 I had in the latest model or the $150 we charge now. We may not charge them more.
But we can charge them. Can we charge them less?
I suppose we could charge them. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping, for example, if we were to have a low income fee waiver or promotion or something.
And
So
how
it's
are the
basically a
BEAD,
cap.
and how are the BEAD areas defined? I know it's supported by the ARPA Act, the ARPA funding, but how is the outline actually defined as BEAD?
So ARPA and BEAD are two totally different funding pots with two totally different rules. So they're both federal in nature, but a simple way to think of it is ARPA is almost completely flexible for how the states wanted to handle it, and BEAD is not that. There's a lot of rules that go along with it. And the way that the BEAD areas were defined is it wasn't actually BEAD areas that was defined, it's BEAD eligible addresses that fell within our district. And again, there's no guarantees at this point that we are the BEAD recipient. We don't know what the VCB is going to do. We don't know what the NTIA is going to do. But since it is a possibility and we have applied and we are hopeful, it is something that we should be considering.
So the BEAD rules are that for any address we're serving, they can only be charged the standard fee for installation, even if it's conduit or a long drop. But
Correct.
we can charge less than the standard.
Correct.
Okay.
And so if you look, I mean, if you actually get into the weeds of what we submitted in our application and WCVT as well, it was a lot heavier on the drop side because we have to account for a lot of potentially buried service.
Sure. Okay.
So in the Act 71 funding we got, I think quite rightly, we put that funding towards building mainline so that we can get as many people, we could have as big a network as possible and get as many people connected aerially as possible rather than spending limited money on construction on people's private property.
And the RFA long drop program is we can only, with that money, we can only serve people who are low income.
Nope, we can serve anyone. It requires us to prioritize three things. So it allows us to fund drops, full stop. But within funding drops over the next, call it year, we need to prioritize manufactured home communities, which we covered last time does not apply because there's only one where we have current service and that main line is excluded under the VCB's policy. Okay, so that's off the table. The other two things that we are required to prioritize, number one is lower income Vermonters. So we need to define what lower income means. And then the second one is orders that are already in the system, essentially, that have stopped because of the cost of the drop, meaning the cost of the conduit. So anyone that's currently registered in our system and is still interested in having service must be prioritized over someone who is not currently in our system.
Okay.
And the lower income bit, again, is over the next year. So it's lower income today, it's lower income 6 months from now, whether the circumstances change or whether we expand the network to a new area that's not BEAD funded or whatever it may be. Or whether the person discovered us in 6 months' time. Hey, Lynn, you have a question.
So if we were to get the long drop money, how long do we have to spend it?
I think it's until September 30th, 2026. I could double check. But basically, it's the source of this funding is the ARPA Capital Projects Fund.
Mhm.
And so it's So all of the ARPA funding must be spent by the end of next year or else it goes away. So that applies for our pre-construction funds as well as our construction funds and our town ARPA match, and then also this. So, and I think the reason that they made it earlier is that it takes time to get the invoice request in through the public service department and out through the chain and whatnot. And I'm pretty sure it's September 30th,
Okay.
26. So about the
Not
next
a
year.
long time, 1 year, basically.
Correct.
Year, 13 months.
Yep.
So
Okay.
what was the eligibility to qualify as a BEAD address if it did not take into consideration it being a second or third home, etc.?
Whether or not, according to information provided by service providers to the FCC, the fastest available speed at that location was less than 100 megabits per second down and 20 megabits per second up. So,
And so-
yeah, purely based on the available service speeds.
So in which case, when it comes to serving low income as a priority under the long drop, then there doesn't need to be a consistency with BEAD as far as identifying or recognizing a home as being primary, secondary, etc., or a Vermont resident, for example.
Correct. And that is another important distinction because the BEAD program originally required there to be a low-cost option, and then in the latest policy notice, the low-cost option can be whatever the provider decides it is, and the states are not allowed to go above and beyond to mandate or even to prioritize applications that made the service more affordable. So the BEAD program explicitly does not care about affordability, but this RFA program using the ARPA funds from the VCBB does care about affordability.
And that leads into my next question, which is, are some of the older already in line for service BEAD eligible addresses that are hanging out there that could in fact be eligible for this long drop funding mechanism?
There should not be any addresses that are BEAD addresses that are eligible for this funding. It's
Okay.
a binary thing because one of the requirements of the BEAD program is that it was not allowed to duplicate existing federal funding. And so all of the areas and addresses that we committed to serve with our construction grants were categorically excluded from BEAD.
Okay, thank you.
Good questions, though. I mean, it is really important to understand the basics before you start going and making decisions.
Well, then, so in your review between the different programs in mentioning consistencies, are there specific aspects or components where consistency would make sense?
I hadn't thought that far, to be honest. I think that the one that we were talking about, so some of what we talked about last time was the situation of people who have second or third properties or locations that aren't inhabited year round, where BEAD doesn't care. It doesn't care if you're there, ever. It's, the requirement is that we build to it and the grant funding funds it. And to some degree, you can think of this as the same way, that there's a pot of ARPA money which is going to turn into a pumpkin if the state doesn't use it, meaning us, doesn't use it by the end of next year. Having said that, it is also a limited pot of money, and we are competing with other providers for it. So we do have to bear that in mind in terms of how we approach things, including, by the way, the seriousness of our outreach to lower income Vermonters, that, if we just sort of wave our hand and don't really make an effort, that may not be judged well as part of an overall application vis-a-vis, for example, NEKCV, who are absolutely going out of their way to do this because it's important to their business plan. So, we're very close friends and collaborators, but we are sometimes competitors with our fellow CUDs.
Is CVOEO willing to help us identify people who need this service?
We had this conversation. They're willing to help us with outreach. They're not willing to share with us confidential lists of customers or anything like that, and it's not really their space to be getting into product sales. But they're willing to, for example, make posters and brochures available and help us identify other community organizations that might be able to do outreach.
Okay, good.
Yep. Great question. So, so back to your other question, Zapata. One of the other things that we talked about is this whole situation of owners versus renters, and how did we feel about the value accruing to a homeowner when, you know, they're the person who wants service is a renter. And so that is one where I think it's actually I would be leaning towards funding the drop under this program in those situations, because otherwise the renter is in a bad situation where if the homeowner won't pay for the conduit, and then the poor renter can't get service, when in fact the renter might want service regardless of their income, you know, or their eligibility under the lower income, right? So that's one where just kind of taking a step back and thinking about things, because I think it's fair and reasonable to be just thinking about the essentially the taxpayer funds that are going into this, and what is actually a fair use of the funds. But I think that whole renter versus owner discussion is one thing where, to my mind, consistency with BEAD and saying, like, we don't actually care where the value might be accruing. I mean, we will require an easement, right? You know, we can't do it without landowner permission, but, you know, we want to help the renter in a manner consistent with how that renter would be treated if it was a BEAD address. Same thing. I mean, if the homeowner won't give us an easement under BEAD, we're not building a conduit. You know, if that person orders service, then, you know, we'll that's a whole other conversation. But, you know, obviously you can't be building things if you don't have permission to build things on private property.
So in other words, then you're looking at consistency, meaning a single household, whether it's a household in an apartment building or a household in an owned home. We're looking at whatever that our poverty level is set at to see if the person is eligible, or their home is eligible, regardless of who the landowner might be.
I think I would in my head, I would separate out the income eligibility from this policy question. Because think of it this way. So suppose, for the sake of argument, we have $500,000 or $1 million to spend on this. So within that, we need to prioritize the two applicable categories: lower income people and people already in the pipeline. So people already in the pipeline, if that takes off 200,000, we have 300,000 left. And of that, we have, well, I suppose there's going to be some that fall into both categories. There could be some lower income people in the pipeline already. So consider those taken care of. So over the next year, we need to reserve a certain amount of that 300,000 for low income households that we don't know about right now that may want service. So, but, you know, we can earmark that. We might say that's $50,000, that's $75,000. But again, I would err towards earmarking that relatively low, because we don't want to have it earmarked so high that then we don't spend the money and then it turns into a pumpkin. Right. But like conceptually, we say, okay, $50,000, that's our, you know, that is guaranteed for lower income people over the next year, first come, first serve. Right. And then the remaining, whatever's left in my calculation there, I think it's 250,000. We spend that, you know, we just spend that down based on people who aren't in the system now who approach us. And one of the things that we can do with this, by the way, is we can use it to just try and drive take rate on the system, because there could be a lot of people who are interested in having our service who are turned off by our current policy and the fact that they'd have to incur costs. And again, similar to what we're doing with the aerial promotion of Virgens right now, we could identify all the addresses that have, like all the ones that have been identified as needing conduit that have canceled, that aren't in the pipeline now, but that, you know, maybe we could tempt them back, who knows, you know, and all of the addresses that, according to Vantage Point Scouts, we believe have a buried portion, and just say, hey guys, this program exists and the money's not good forever. So, you know, if you ever want to have a free conduit put in, now's the time.
Yeah, yeah.
That $50,000, if we say $50,000, whatever that level is that only inclusive of the actual installation, or would that be like, so for example, if I met that, and given my situation, I'm a mile away from the last electrical pole, half mile away from the last telephone pole, and there's nobody else around, I would assume that my installation is pretty expensive.
Yep.
And so is it that entire cost? And if I'm the one who want it, but meanwhile there are, say, 10 houses between me and where I have to hook in, does that give us opportunity to have additional hookups regardless of their income level, for example.
Okay, so there's two questions there. I'm going to tackle the second one first. In the second scenario, if there's multiple houses that we're passing, we would not consider that a drop conduit. We consider that a buried mainline fiber service, which this drop is not covering, or this program is not covering. So
Even though
this
it would be coming to me requesting it, and I'm requesting I'm eligible for a long drop, it would still fall into a different category? Because that would be the only reason why you're running it.
Well, we'd have to. I mean, I'm not familiar with the topography of where you are. Like, if you're at the end of a long private road with a whole bunch of houses between you and the main road, then that building fiber on that private road, building mainline or not, is a different question than this. But this
Okay.
program is meant to cover from the main line, basically from the road, whether it's a private road or a public road, to your property, or to wherever that conduit terminates. And the other part of your question is, so like, suppose that you're not the end of a private road. Suppose you're just like 2 miles from the road on your own property, and you don't have utility poles and whatever. Maybe you're off grid. I don't even know. Actually, that's another question that I hadn't even thought of, which is that off-grid addresses are excluded under Act 71, and I don't know that we should actually look and see if the rules say anything about that. But regardless, so let's pretend you're on grid. Let's make it simple. So you're on grid, but it's just super far from the road, and it's like $50,000 to connect you. Well, that is something else where I think it was in the policy questions we should decide. I mean, in my mind, there should be some sort of a threshold where if your drop is excessively expensive and it's going to chow a large amount of whatever our grant award is, then we're not going to cover the whole thing. And so like this notion that you're going to earmark an amount for lower income people also needs to play in with what are the rules there, because what happens if you have a lower income person who is renting a house that's 2 miles from the road and it's $50,000 for the drop, right? So there sort of has to be an order of operations for how these things are applied.
So we would be able to potentially apply a cap to an installation cost to any one particular household.
We can do whatever the heck we want. And I mean, this is the fun of this program, is that we have only a couple of weeks to figure out how we want all these rules to work in order that we can put in our application.
Jeez.
And if we don't have a main line in place, and a main line has to be built out before that address can be serviced, how does that play into the overall financial scheme of Maple Broadband, or an area that we're currently not like servicing fully, for example?
Well, we need to define this as being drops off our current, off the then current mainline network. Because
Okay.
like you, for example, like, if you, like, you can't put in, like, our closest mainline to you is like Middlebury, right? Or like Salisbury, right? I mean,
Right.
you can't put in and say, you need to pay, this $2 million to get over, up to Ripton and put in a hub in order to serve me. No. So it's, and similarly, Shannon also probably couldn't, because, your subdivision has buried service and we don't have mainline in there. So this just from that is a simple, if the RFA doesn't mandate that, that's a simple boundary that we can set to say this is for whatever areas are in active service. It's not for areas that are not in active service. And if we build them with other money, because we do have some construction grant money left in town ARPA and ARPA match. And so there will be some areas that are built that are not with BEAD money if we're successful in BEAD. So it's not just the network as it exists today, it's the network as it may exist over time where the BEAD rules don't apply.
That's very helpful in the context of setting an amount that we might want to earmark.
Well, that makes me think about if the priority, if a piece of the priority is the orders already in the system, is it relatively easy to know where they are and how big a cost it will be to provide them, to install for them?
Yeah, we have all that information. One of the things that I haven't done yet is we can estimate what the cost is using just thumb sucking, $15 a foot or something like that, which is probably a pretty reasonable way of doing it, because in order anyway to come up with a bid for this, I'm going to say the same thing now that I said to Roger and Steve the other day, which is that I'm not terribly inclined to do a whole bunch of work in advance of actually knowing that we're successful in the grant and knowing the amount of the grant. I mean, there's some pre-work that makes sense, but above and beyond that, it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense.
So if we lay out the parameters and then we get the grant, then we can do the figuring.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think we can estimate, and it would probably behoove us to at least have some preliminary conversations with some of our contractors to say, look, this thing is coming down the pike, and if we're successful, can you give us some sort of a sense of what you would charge a bulk rate per foot, like this is what's in the pipeline now, just so we, because $15 is a thumb suck, but like if the actual number that they're all coming in at is like, 10 to 12, then that makes a difference knowing that we're competing with other CUDs. But that doesn't mean we need to figure out every single detail of how we're going to work
Right.
out with them, or like what the contract, like we should say what's going to be in like what we're going to require of the households. Like, hey, I mean, there needs to be an easement full stop, right? And then if we're going to require a minimum service commitment, how that's going to work. If the minimum service commitment is going to be larger, so if it's like, $0 to $5,000 is 6 months and $5,000 to $10,000 is 12 months, or like whatever those tiers are, like we can define, and I think we should define what those are so it doesn't feel like a bait and switch to anyone. But that doesn't mean we need to go pay lawyers to make legal agreements until such time as we've actually gotten the grant. We don't need to go
Of course.
negotiate because I mean, the contractors are going to have a gazillion questions. I don't want to get into those until we actually know that this thing is happening. Does that all make sense?
Yes. So
Yep.
given the amount of time we have left, what do you need us to talk about further?
Yeah, well, let's go back to the policy questions now that we've talked into the context some more.
Yeah.
So, okay, so so policy question number 1, I think that's what eligibility criteria do we want to go with? Let me take this one. I'm going to do a little bit more homework there to just confirm what NEC is doing now and see if Krista's on vacation, but see if Tonya has any thoughts about what percent of federal poverty level, but more importantly, why. And then I can put something out as a straw man. But I feel like that's probably a pretty simple and straightforward one. We want to just copy paste from existing things as much as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, there is this part here that we need. So the pre-signups that we're required to prioritize, we are also required to describe the specific measures to ensure program resources are directed toward those who genuinely need financial assistance to obtain service. So, the document's a little bit internally inconsistent, but I think I interpret this as we must, similar to what we were saying earlier with that example you had, Zapata, of like, what if someone lives really far from the road and it's going to cost us $50,000 to connect them? Because we do have the information, Nancy, of the ones that have been scouted. We know how many feet it is, and so we could do a rough estimate of how much we think that conduit would cost.
Yeah.
But we also had Matthew go and pull the property values from the grand list, which is not perfect, but it's something. So we could, for example, say, if a house is over $750,000 or whatever, and the cost exceeds X, we're going to exclude it or require there to be a cost share, something like that. So that is a decision that's, and just conceptually, we've talked about this as a concept that we may want there to be a cost share under certain circumstances. We need to define what we want those circumstances to be. And I think probably my view, I haven't done the homework yet, although I have the raw data, but I can come back and propose to you guys, based on the ones in the pipeline today and based on the property values, like what I think is a reasonable cutoff above which some sort of cost share would apply. And both in terms of the cost from the program and then the property value, because I bet things will group in such a way that it's kind of logical. And if it doesn't, then I'll show you the two. I'll show you the multiple clusters. I mean, it's just a graphing thing.
Yeah.
Do the graph and look at what the clusters tell us. And if there's multiple clusters, we can make a policy choice. And if there isn't, it's going to be a pretty straightforward recommendation.
And my one question about that process, Ellie, would be, and I'll use myself as an example. We bought our home 20 years ago for $126,000. We just were reappraised, and the initial reappraisal came in at $460,000. And let me tell you, our incomes have not increased at the same level as the house appraisal. In which case, is there an opportunity for homeowners where their house has been reappraised at a a much higher level than they ever bought it at. I mean, I think of like Lakeshore Properties, for example, right, who are now through the roof, and they bought it when it was a little camp. Is there an avenue or an option for landowners to be able to provide supplemental materials, documents that might impact what a cost share could look like?
Well, that's a great question. I guess the question is, how complex do we want to make this? So,
Well, I
every,
mean, she's got a point because
She
home
has a great
values
point.
in Vermont have skyrocketed all over the
Skyrocketed.
state.
yeah, but I think, I mean, is using this as a way to set a bar I mean, they've escalated, and I understand not everyone's had been reappraised recently, but the data is not going to be perfect. But I think it's a way to identify, because we need to meet this requirement some way, shape, or form. And so I think what I'm hearing from you guys, which is reasonable, is that we should set that number pretty high. Because, again, part of the policy objective here is parity of the BEAD program, where none of these things have to apply. And I mean, yes, Zapata, we could do something like that. We'd have to find a service provider to do it, which, we haven't talked to CVOEO about that. And I'm hesitant to be trying to overload them especially because they're saying in general, they don't want to charge for the service. I don't want to take advantage of that and start throwing a whole bunch of other things at them.
Yeah.
But conceptually, yes, we can define whatever rules, whatever verifications we want, and then find someone that will pay to do that, because it won't be me and it won't be a volunteer. And it needs to be done independently and fairly and with proper paperwork and so on. And then
I
we can
wonder
charge
if the
that to the
Regional
program.
Planning Commission folks can help us with that question.
They probably could, but where I'm going with this is I'd really rather avoid it. I'd rather things just be simple, where we just have a set of rules and we make the rules as broad as we can, so that we're meeting what the program is requiring us to do without requiring anyone, including ourselves, to jump through excessive hoops and paperwork.
Okay,
So
because really
could
at
a
the end,
rule
we just want
be-
to spend the money before it turns into a pumpkin. Okay.
So could the rule be a house appraised at $750,000 or less, or an income level, household level of 200% of poverty level or 300% of poverty level? So you could utilize either one of those mechanisms to meet that eligibility.
Yep. Yeah, and the thing I'm talking about making sure people actually need service, that only applies to the ones in the pipeline.
Right.
So I
Right.
think but yes, it would make sense categorically to say, if you have gone through the steps of qualifying as lower income in order, for whatever reason, including potentially that we're offering you a subsidy, no one's going to bother to take the time to look at your home value, right? Because you automatically qualify. Lynn's had her hand up for a little while.
Yeah. Just again, Ellie, to say that I support like coming up with the policy and the rules, because we only have a year, and to be going back and forth with people and then wanting to like get the thing built. I mean, I just feel like a year isn't very much time.
Yep, I agree with that.
So, keeping it as simple as possible without unfairly excluding people. I hear, can people that desire to, have a process where people can disagree with the finding, but that could just bog down the process for them even getting connected. So anyway, this is all to say I support keeping it as simple as possible.
Yep. Okay, so I think we have some good guidance on that one. I think, having said that, something you guys should maybe put in your back pockets, think about, is for property values that are over whatever threshold we set, what sort of a policy do you want? Is it like a 50-50 cost share? Is it, we'll pay for the first up to $20,000 and then you move on? And again, I'm making up that number because I think that the data that's in our pipeline now of what the kind of like typical conduit prices are will help us set what that cap is. But it's more a question of what you want the rule to be beyond that. Is it the homeowner pays everything beyond that? The homeowner pays, half of what's beyond that. So I think that's something we need to figure out.
Isn't that going to depend on how much money we have as well?
Well, that's another thing as well. I mean, yes, yes. So we have multiple things we're working with here. We have requirements to prioritize, and then we have the period of time, and we have the fact that the application it's a once-off application. It's not on a rolling basis, and so we have to estimate what the future needs are going to be. One of the things I should say, by the way, just to repeat the point I made last week, is that this is a fixed amount subaward. And so the money doesn't turn into a pumpkin so long as we build the number of drops we say we're going to build. So that's also important that, a little bit contradicting my statement earlier, that if we have a higher cost per foot, as long as it's not unreasonably high, that builds in a little bit of contingency so that because what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to get an award to build 300 drops and then we build 250 and then now we haven't actually met our grant requirements and there's probably going to be some clawback, like that money would turn into a pumpkin. So we want to make sure that whatever it is that we're putting in, we want to make sure that we're building at least the number of drops that we say we're going to build, and then above and beyond that, we set policy rules to try and make the money stretch as far as it can within the bounds of trying to be simple and fair. This really is a lot of complexity without a lot of time. Steve.
We're almost out of time. We're going to have Nancy turn into a pumpkin here.
Well,
what you're asking us a lot to the things that you want us to consider. What do you think about drafting a straw man based on your best judgment and then distribute it to us so that we have something to actually, say, yes, we don't want to do, yes, let's do that, but no, I don't want to do that. Because I'm afraid otherwise we're not going to make a lot of progress here.
Yeah, it's a fair point, Steve. I can do that, and I didn't want to be doing that completely on my own without any sort of guidance or signaling as to how you guys were thinking about it. But we've now talked about this for probably an hour over 2 meetings, and so I think I do have a sense of how you guys are thinking about it. So,
well, you've really helped me think about it especially in terms of the money turning into a pumpkin, the wanting to keep it simple, the therefore not caring if the owners of the property are the people requesting or if the people are renting. It really doesn't matter. I have a whole new perspective about it, and that's been helpful.
Yep. Okay. Because I'm just glancing at some of the questions now, and I feel like, to Steve's point, we've had enough of a discussion that I think I could come up with a straw man for some of these things. And
I think it's really helpful, Ellie, in that now if I get that document from you, that I actually understand the context in which it's being recommended from, and clearing up some of the procedural questions, definitions, how different pots of money are or are not the same, the levels of consistencies, and where differences could come into play.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. Well, I think that's enough guidance for me then.
Is there anything else you needed to ask us?
I don't think so. I think I'm good, and we're just about at time anyway. Does anyone else have anything they want to say on this program, or anything else you want to raise under other business?
I just want to say I'm, again, eternally astounded by your willingness to put up with a lot of what they make you put up with. So thank you.
Well, Nancy, you said it, I didn't, and no, you're not paying me enough. Kidding. Alrighty. Okay, so our next meeting then is September 3rd at the usual time. And just a heads up to everyone on this call, I've already spoken to Adam here at the ACRPC, but Zapata is, I think, would be a great member of the executive committee. Not that it's up to me, but that's my own 2 cents. I think she's already contributed a lot in the meetings here. And she's indicated that Tuesdays and Wednesdays do not work for her for executive committee meetings during the growing season, and Mondays and Thursdays would work. So that's something that I'm going to have on the agenda for next Wednesday's meeting for us to talk about to see. So since most of you guys are here, I can tell Cy, or maybe Steve, you can tell Cy, just pop her a mail to let her know, and then everyone can come prepared to have that discussion so I'm not springing it on you.
Didn't you want to talk to Adam first?
I've spoken to Adam here. He's going to come to the meeting next week, and
Oh,
He said in general Mondays are better, but again, I don't want to be trying to like rush a decision without everyone all present to really think through it.
can we take a straw poll about Monday right now?
Well, we don't have Psy, but we can. It works. It's fine with me.
And just for further context, I would be looking at the second and fourth Mondays of each month because I have prior commitments on the first and third.
And what happened to Thursdays? We used to have Thursdays.
And that for me
We
would
moved to
also be
Wednesdays to
fine.
accommodate Jeff's schedule.
Okay, but Jeff isn't on the committee anymore, right?
Yep. So Thursdays are possible. Adam did say that Mondays are better for him for having ACRPC available to facilitate the public meeting. But that, I think people's availability should be more important than the availability. I mean, I'm a 10-minute drive away. I do sometimes travel, so someone else will have to come here if I'm not available, but c'est la vie. Okay.
In which
So-
case, Ellie, do you want me to attend next week's meeting or?
I would love you to. I mean, there's a bunch of other things that don't relate to this schedule, and I don't think that your presence is a conflict in any way.
Okay.
So,
Yes, so why don't you go ahead and invite me, add me to whatever the email is that goes out with the Teams link, and I will put it on my schedule for 3:30.
yep, 3:30 to 5.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, thank you guys for the great discussion today, and we can adjourn, and I will see you all next week, Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.